Well, hello today. I'm here with Julia Malott, and I'm so pleased to be able to have this conversation. We're we just had a little chat right before hitting record, but it's the first time we're actually meeting, and we've exchanged a couple messages on Twitter and stuff. And I've been so I love hearing people who come from a reasonable sort of middle of the road. I'm trying not to say the word centrist because I feel like it's kind of being overused, but centrist perspective on these heated topics. And I've been watching your videos, and I just really love the way you're able to handle some of the gender issues with nuance and respect to and not taking a polar side. So thank you for agreeing to have a conversation with me today, Julia.
Oh, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So um, like I said, I've really just been enjoying your perspective and enjoying the balance that you bring to these issues, which seem to be so unbalanced lately. And I wonder, how did you first get involved in speaking about this in a public way? What made you decide to bring your perspective out onto YouTube or onto the internet?
Yeah, I'd say it was a roundabout journey. I transitioned a little over 5 years ago, or I started transitioning a little over 5 years ago. And so I went through lots of phases. I went through a hide everything in the closet and don't talk to anybody phase and don't want to leave my house. And then I went through what I'll call a progressive phase, kind of really diving into that ideology in terms of what I felt affirming.
Mm-hmm.
And then I had some amazing life coaching about 3 years ago that my work provided me. And it was a year long, and I had one-on-one access to this coach as many times as I wanted a week. And I made the best of that. I was really thankful to have that. And so I read many books with all kinds of diverse backgrounds and perspectives. And coming out of that, I realized some of the thought patterns in myself that was leading to a lot of the struggles that I was encountering. And it was easy to offload those on everybody else and say that it was society or it was individuals. But I kind of realized I'm empowered to make my life whatever I want to make it. So coming out of that, I was adopting this new worldview. And then I live in near Toronto, Ontario. And we have a lot of uprise in our school boards right now in terms of concerns about what's being taught related to sex and gender in many different school boards. And so in early 2022, an individual named Carolyn Berjowski went to our school board, and she had concerns about certain books in terms of what was being presented, whether it was age appropriate, and whether certain books might glamorize transition and kind of edge kids towards transition who maybe it's not appropriate for. And of course, I wasn't watching that meeting live, because who watched school boards meetings live in 2022? I certainly didn't. But her presentation was cut off by the chair because they felt that it was a human rights violation to really even broach these topics. And they then sent out a note to all of the parents. And I have a daughter who is in high school here, so I got that email, and I couldn't not seek out the video because I thought, oh, something transphobic happened. I got to know what this is. Yeah. And the board had pulled it, but I found it on Twitter. And I remember getting to the end of that video and thinking, but where's the bad part? It cuts off. And I assumed there was more, and she must have said something really bad. And then that was the moment it kind of clicked for me of, no, she didn't. What we're saying is bad is simply the fact that she's asking questions and has any concerns at all. And I come from the municipal space. I have worked in municipal administration previously. And so I knew that this was an election year, and it was going to be a school board election year as well. And so that moment I kind of thought, oh gosh, we're going to get the extremes on both the left and the right are going to come out and run for the school board in response to this. And I kind of thought maybe I'm a voice who needs to speak publicly because I am transgender. So I do understand this space in terms of a lot of the impacts and implications, but I also understood what concerns this teacher was raising and thought the conversations are important. So I ran. I was not elected, but I met a lot of really great people on both sides of this divide through that process. And I took to social media afterwards to try to express those views in as nuanced and conversational way as possible.
So it sounds like you witnessed firsthand the maligning of someone and the association of rather I guess to use the word again, just rather nuanced views with something that's really extreme, that false equivalency. And then you felt like you needed to jump in and join that conversation to bring balance to it.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what I saw here in our school board. And it's something I've seen across many school boards. I'm now involved in many parent groups across this province and also across the country.
Mhm.
And the same pattern seems to happen again and again, where an individual raises a concern and they're told they can't have the conversation because of the topic itself, not because of how they said it or what they said. I
Mhm.
think that hate certainly does exist, and it's absolutely possible to present something in a way that's just inappropriate and hurtful. But I've seen far too many times that something's presented very politely. It's not about an individual. It's just saying, I want to talk about washroom usage, or I want to
Mhm.
talk about books. And they're told, no, we don't talk about that here. And if
Mhm.
we can't talk about that in a school board meeting, then where can we talk about it? Because that's where we establish policy. This is not a classroom. This is a bunch of
Mhm.
adults who get together to set governance bylaws. And if
Mhm.
we can't talk about it there, that's concerning to me.
Yeah, it's really strange to have things be off limits that way. It doesn't feel like anything we've really encountered before. So
Exactly.
it really stands out. And I should have done this at the beginning of the recording. I should have asked you to introduce yourself a little bit for people who may not be familiar with you yet.
Oh, yeah,
So
absolutely.
going backwards, would you mind giving just a little brief intro and tell people who you are?
Sure. So my name is Julia Malott. I live in Canada here in Ontario, near Toronto. I am transgender. I started my transition a little over 5 years ago. I am pretty boring beyond that. I have a daughter who is finishing up high school, and I have a partner, and I have two dogs, two matching Westie puppies. I say puppies, but they're almost 9 years old, so they're not
Oh,
puppies anymore, but they feel like puppies to me.
they're perma babies.
Perma baby. I like that term,
Yeah.
perma baby.
So you have a lot, it's like called Alotta Thoughts, your
Yes.
channel, and and you do these little videos where you give sort of your take on a given issue. And I've watched a few of these and I really enjoy them. You did one on pronouns. You did like a series on pronouns. You did a series
Yeah.
on schools doing social transitions for children and parents' rights. And I find myself agreeing with most everything that you have said. I really like your perspective quite a bit. And I wonder what kind of feedback do you get from people what do you tend to get positive feedback for your views, or do you get a lot of the polar? Because I feel like I get a lot of positive responses from people who are agreeing with basically my position, but then the negatives fall into two camps, and they're the two predictable camps. It's either you're a bigot or you're not going hard enough. You're a lefty, so what's your response look like?
That's interesting. I would love to compare our hate messages and see how they vary. But no, I get tons of positivity, a lot of positive responses, a lot of private messages. I have a huge backlog. I feel so bad because if somebody takes the time to write me a message, I want to respond. And
Mhm.
I have been at that point for the past 2 months that I just can't respond to everything thoughtfully.
Mhm.
And so I'm actually taking a quick break from Twitter for the summer in order to focus on personal stuff. And one of the things I'm doing is getting through all of those messages so I can respond to everybody. But I do get tons of positivity. There
Mhm.
is also lots of negative comments as well. I I kind of in my head have divided those into three different groups, not just the
Okay.
two. There is the so I try to stay very centrist in the middle as much as possible, which
Mhm.
does mean that the two extremes kind of can take issue with that. So
Mhm.
on the progressive side, there is the trans rights activists who have kind of a very dogmatic perspective on what it means to be trans and what it means to accept somebody who's trans. And so
Mhm.
some of the views that I express don't always align with that. So I do get some pushback from that side. But I also get pushback on the left from the radical feminist movement,
Mm, mhm.
which is interesting, of course, because the trans activists and the radical feminists, I would argue that ideologically they're both left, but they're both using the same principles of postmodern deconstructive to kind of fire at each other because they have this
Wow.
competing rights issue. And so both of them come at me while they're coming at each other, but I'm kind of a common enemy. And then
Wow. That's
at the same
really
time,
interesting.
yeah, it is. I've wanted to write an essay about kind of what I've seen there, and it's something maybe I'll do this summer while I have some time off. And then the other piece, of course, is the far right
Mhm.
extreme kind of views as well, which I also receive. Yeah, there's a lot of negativity out there, but there is more positivity than negativity. So for me, that definitely means that there's an important conversation to be had here.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that's real. It's so interesting how you can see like the bifurcation of that leftist progressive criticism. And if you write that essay, I would love to read it, because it sounds like you're in a unique position to take heat from those two sides in a really interesting way. What a fascinating cultural moment this is.
It really is. It really is. And I'm not much of an essay writer. I'm more of a quick take writer. That's why I do my 6-minute videos where I pack usually 1,200, 1,300 words max. So I haven't done a video on this exact topic because I don't think 1,300 words can do it justice. There's a lot of theory that kind of needs to be underlaid to even dive into it. So it might be more of an essay topic, but I have not written an essay in a very long time, not since my university days.
Well, you can use that old formula, but plug it in, that same essay
exactly.
outline. Yeah. So when you get heat from trans rights activists, and so there's been this big growing movement of the LGB without the T, but is there a growing movement of the T that is not in support of some of the more radical aspects of gender ideology? Are you seeing a lot of transgender people that agree with your position and take a more centrist view?
I don't know if I would call it a movement or not. I felt very, very much like I was the only one for a long time, which wasn't true. I have, as I've become vocal on Twitter, I've encountered probably 15, 20 other people total, but I'm a very, very prominent voice in this right now. And if I've only encountered 15 or 20 people who seem to kind of share that view, then maybe that's not a movement. What I do know is there are lots of people who share these views and feel this way, but they're not prepared to speak up. The viewpoint is very homogenous. And so the pushback is intense. I've seen that myself. So I know lots of individuals who aren't interested in kind of going in and discussing this stuff.
Yeah, that's
I'm just going to pause you for a moment. My dog is whining like crazy.
Oh yeah, go for it.
Lift itself up onto the couch. Okay, I'm sorry.
No worries. I've had to pause and yell at kids. So
that's fair.
Yeah. The label transphobic, and this is one of the things you made a video about this, the way that people are so quick to, it's sort of like the school board example that you gave. You see somebody who's giving a criticism and they get labeled with the worst slurs that the ideology has to throw at them. And this is what makes people afraid to speak out. They're going to be slandered. They're going to be people who are, especially people who are classically liberal and have always associated themselves with the progressive movements, think of themselves as being open-minded, don't want to be associated with something like racism or bigotry or transphobia or any of these other intolerant labels that could be applied to us. And yet, as these labels are being used more and more, they seem to be losing their teeth. Like when I don't know if you're familiar with the stuff that I've done, but I made a video about 8 months ago calling out my graduate school for the ideology in the counseling program that I was in. And the main thing was really the racial stuff. The main thing was the CRT. And so I was talking about how we were being asked to handle race in relationship with our clients, and that it was concerning to me because it strips away individuality and it boils people down to, race being one of the most important things about you as you walk into a counseling office. And my concerns around this, the school watched that video and put out a message to the entire student body that called me a white supremacist and a transphobe for some of the things that I said in that video. And the thing that was, it didn't hurt my feelings. It didn't make me feel bad. It didn't make me feel slandered necessarily. It actually felt like a gift to me, because anybody can go and watch that short video and see how untrue their statement is, and then look at their statement next to it, and it makes my point. It just proves my point so beautifully that this ideology has lost its mind. It's not dealing with reason and rationality. But I really enjoyed the way that you described that, the way that this woman, Carolyn, your depiction of the school board slandering her in a similar way, and your knowledge of her behind the scenes. I don't know. What do you think about this labeling and this like false equivalency? If you say anything, if you ask any questions, you're automatically shunted into an extremist camp.
Yeah, labeling is not helpful. I mean, I try to avoid it. And one thing I have learned trying to stay somewhat central and bridging the gap here is that part of our problem is the language is so different. People are using words in very, very different ways. If we use racism as an example, classically racism has meant, overt acts of discrimination against an individual, whether that's verbal, whether that's physical. And that's how we've treated it in the past. Where we've moved to on the progressive side is systematic racism, or in other words, systems in our culture that might yield unequitable outcomes. And words are words. We make up words as a society. So you can argue either definition if you want, but if we're not using the same definition, that creates a problem for communication. And the thing I found when it comes to words like racism or transphobia is that not only have the definitions changed, but one side is utilizing the kind of really strong negativity around it to their advantage as the definition has changed. So transphobia is a silly word. I've had lots of people complain, this is not a fear. And I agree, it's not a fear. I don't think it's a good word, but classically transphobia and homophobia referred similar to racism, like overt acts of hate against an individual, whether that's verbal or physical. And now we've moved to this place that anything that does not establish equitable outcomes, explicitly establish equitable outcomes for gay or trans people as homophobic or transphobic, that is not hate, though. Maybe that's a problem, maybe it's not. We could debate that, but that's not hate. And when we're using the word we used to use to denote hate, it can, I think, trigger for a lot of people that saying, oh, wow, I really don't want to be hateful. I really don't want to be like that. I need to check myself, when maybe you do. Like, hate does exist, but there's lots of cases, and Carolyn's a perfect example there where that wasn't what was plain true. And there's real life impacts to that. Carolyn is a fantastic example. I did not know her at the time, but she's become a very close friend of mine since. And it upsets me greatly to see the narrative in our school board and in our community put out that she's transphobic. Why? Because they're just told, that's what we're all saying, she's transphobic because she did this presentation. And yet she's one of the people who deeply supports me when I need emotional support, when I need to chat with someone. I'll call Carolyn up and she's there for me. And so I can't reconcile with how you could define her as transphobic. That doesn't mean she agrees with every aspect of the way I am living, but I don't agree with many aspects of other people's life choices as well. And that doesn't mean that I hate them.
Right. Yeah. That's it. That's really interesting, because that's something that I've been thinking about, is that we went from wanting tolerance, which I guess tolerance would be the absence of aggression or moves to eliminate something. So it'd be allowing something, whatever it is, to exist. We moved from needing tolerance to needing acceptance, which is the next level. And now we're all the way at celebration. And if it's not celebrated, then it's hated. And so that's been an interesting thing to observe culturally.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that there's been that progression. As far as where I stand, I think that tolerance is necessary. We can't have a functioning society if we don't have tolerance for people who are different than us, whether that be ethnic diversity or whether that be LGBT diversity or whatnot. I think acceptance is important as well. I think I probably stand somewhere between that tolerance and acceptance points on that kind of gradation that you've laid out there. But I do agree that moving to the place of celebration is concerning. It's concerning because I don't think I'm somebody to be celebrated. One of my takeaways, as I've really kind of thought deeply about how we're handling transgender matters in society at large right now, is we are treating this like something to be celebrated. Like, diversity is good for the sake of diversity. And the way that I see it, I have a disability. Something is wrong with me. I don't know what that is. It could be psychosocial. It could be biological. There's a lot of things we don't know about why people have gender dysphoria, but something is wrong with me. And being allowed to transition, living in a society that allows that to take place, has been immensely helpful for me to be able to cope, to be able to thrive, and to be able to contribute to this society. So I am so thankful that we allow that in ways that we didn't even a few years ago. But that doesn't mean it's something to be celebrated insofar as something's not wrong with me. I'm biologically male, and that caused me great pain and discomfort. And it's not something to be celebrated. If a kid could transition or could not transition, I would always say we should encourage that kid not to transition. This isn't something we do for fun. This is something we do because we need to. And that is the narrative that I have seen shift in our schools and in our society, is more of these are neutral things of It's like
Mhm.
picking an occupation or deciding what color to paint your house, whatever you like. If you like a pink house, have a pink house. If you like a greenhouse, have a greenhouse. And I think that's fine for house color. I don't think that's a good thing when it comes to surgical and hormonal interventions.
Yeah, that's a really mature and sober take. And it's not something I hear expressed very much anymore. The idea that this is actually a therapeutic process in order to treat something that has gone wrong for a person in their life. And what I think is interesting is something else I think I've heard you say is that being trans isn't the most interesting thing about you. It's not like that's not who you are. It's just a thing about you. And that's something I think that gets lost. It's sort of become celebrated in the culture as this end point and this thing it's an identity. And I think if you stop at one thing about you, like gender or race or one aspect of yourself, aren't you stunting your own ability to develop and grow as a person? Because there's so much more about everybody besides these little demographic labels that we could use. And it would be nice to think that a person would be able to, if they chose to in their life, take steps to transition and then continue living a life and live a richer and better life post that decision, and not just now make their entire life about that decision. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with everything you said there. And I do think that lots of people, as they mature after transitioning, find that place. At least they used to. The people who I know who are trans, who are much older, seem to have found that. I'm seeing less of it with the younger generation. I have a lot of thoughts around identity. That's another essay I want to write and haven't yet kind of taken a stab into. But my life coach that I had a few years ago, he would say that identity is something that you honor as yourself. When you take something that is not you and you kind of treat it as though it is you. And I think that's a somewhat cynical way to look at identity, but I found that immensely helpful because it kind of focused for me the idea that if I take something, whether that's being a parent or whether that's being trans or whether that's being good at volleyball, and I'm horrible at volleyball, by the way, but let's say I was good at volleyball or thought I was good at volleyball, and I kind of create an identity out of that, then I'm creating an opportunity to be hurt, and I'm creating an opportunity to lose myself, because I might think I'm great at volleyball and you might not. And so you can hurt me by kind of, letting me realize that you don't see me as I see me, or that could be taken away from me because I could be injured and now I'm not good at volleyball. And I think that's a very natural human thing to do, to have these identities. I'm certainly not criticizing people for having them, but what I have tried to do through a lot of my own therapy over the last few years has been to decenter those identities and say, I am the physicality of what I am my mind, and I'm nothing more than that. And so I have had surgeries. I have taken estrogen for 5 years. There's an impact to that, but it doesn't have to mean anything specific about me. And as I've reached that place of almost Zen in a certain sense, it's, I don't care about these matters so much. Am I a man? Am I a woman? It's like, I don't care. Like we could discuss that. It depends on how we define those words, but it doesn't matter either way, because I have nothing vested in any particular outcome to that question, versus a few years ago, before I kind of worked through a lot of this stuff in this matter, I would have had a very, nope, I'm a woman because I transitioned, and it meant something to me. And that, of course, is very problematic.
Your life coach sounds amazing.
He was wonderful.
Sounds like such a great process of self-discovery that you went through.
It really was. I felt very fortunate. I was moving into leadership in my company. And so I was given this coach that often works with CEOs and people who are paid much more than I am. And I thought, I'm so fortunate to have this opportunity. Like, I am going to make the best of it. And so I was asking for book recommendations every week, and I would go and read them that week, and kind of do my homework, because I wanted to get the most out of it that I could. Because at the time, I was scared of, I only have this for a year. And what will happen when it's gone? And one thing he also taught me through that process was, I can continue. Like, once I learned how to think critically about myself, I don't need a coach. I can continue to do that by continuing to follow those patterns and processes and being curious. So I'm so thankful that he kind of kickstarted that journey for me a few years ago.
Well, it sounds like your own openness also was just a critical aspect to that. Your own interest in self-development and in being curious about life and about discovery of yourself. I think that's really impressive.
Yeah, I went into that coaching with some I won't say objectives, but a lot of anger. So
Oh,
this
really?
was fairly early in my transition, and I wasn't on
Okay.
speaking terms with my family at all. I
Mhm.
had they were very religious, well, they still are
Mhm.
very religious, and so they did not accept my transition, and I had kind of cut them off.
Mhm.
And I remember on my very first coaching session, I was telling my coach about this, and
Mhm.
he could obviously sense everything I was creating out of that experience.
Mhm.
And his response to me was, "Are you going to trade love to be right?"
Mhm.
And I sat with that for a few weeks after that, and kind of what he was saying was, I can dig my foot in on this and say I'm correct and these people have hurt me, and maybe they have. Or
Mhm.
I can choose that I want to have these relationships, and I can decide that I'm going to work past that and work through it and own those relationships rather than just be a victim in it. And
Mhm.
that was the very first session I had, so I had a lot to learn from that point. But by the end of the year, I had reconciled with everybody in my family, and while there are still some tensions to be worked out a few years later, I have those relationships back, and that was huge.
That's amazing. And that's really good advice. And I think that that's one of the best things that we can say to people we love when we're in conflict, and or even if we only say it internally, is I love you more than I care about being right. And it's about the connection and not about, you know, I guess establishing who's correct and winning. What do you win really when you win an argument with somebody you love?
Yeah,
I guess it depends, but
you can go into that competitive thing that still happens with my partner occasionally, where I'll kind of forget.
Mhm.
And it's like you start to dive in and get angry because no, you said this, you did this,
Mhm.
you whatever. And then I'll have to catch myself and go, wait a minute, like it doesn't matter who's
Mhm.
at fault here. We don't have to know who to assign the blame to. What do we
Mhm.
want to create? How are we going to build workability here? And in the end, it's an argument about salad or something like that. It
Yeah,
doesn't
yeah,
matter.
exactly. Well, and when you entered that space and that coaching space, and you were in that, and you were experiencing that cutoff from your family, that sort of hard stop, um, you moved forward from that and started thinking about things differently. So that makes me wonder about how, because you're also a lot younger than I am, and one of the experiences I had when I was in graduate school was I noticed that the younger people seem to be more easily swept up into the race and gender ideology than, and I think it was likely because they've been getting it more heavily in school and in the culture. And I, as somebody who had already grown out of that, and I was out of that phase of life, I wasn't in academia, I wasn't really consuming a lot of popular culture. um, I I wasn't as influenced by it steadily, and so these people who'd had more of a steady diet of this were more willing to accept it. And so I kind of wonder about young people who are able to pull themselves out and what that process is like. Was there an unlearning or a deprogramming process for you, do you feel, or had you always had a more balanced view of things?
No, there definitely was that process. I probably wasn't as deep into it as some because I'm old enough that I graduated high school kind of before a lot of this transition that's described
Hmm.
in like Jonathan Haidt's book and stuff kind of came into play.
Hmm.
So I don't think I had as much to unlearn as some people, but I still had that mindset, and I think transitioning is part of it because my experience of transitioning was very similar to many people's. Of you have this dysphoria, you decide you're going to transition, you're very uncomfortable with it, and you're going to have to tell everybody. The one thing I've always found very, both at the time terrifying, and now I find it beautiful about being trans, is that everybody knows. You walk into a room, not everybody knows, but most people know. It's very obvious. It's not like being gay, where if you're
Hmm.
uncomfortable, if you're in an environment you think this is not a safe place to be gay, you can just not hold hands. You can just not share who your partner is. You don't have to let people know, but I can't hide from it.
Hmm.
And so a lot of people who are transitioning go into that period where they kind of pull into themselves and do it behind the scenes. They have their affirming group, and they're maybe being called a different name within that friendship circle, but by and large at their job and out in society, they haven't made those steps public. And I think when you do that, you're especially susceptible to groupthink because you
Hmm.
now have this affirming group that makes you feel good. They're the people you want to be around, and they're the people who are calling you what you want to be called and saying what you want to say, and who have a very kind of homogenous way of thinking about these matters. And so I was in that too when in the early days of my transition. And I think that, at least from my experience, there was a lot of self-victimization that came out of that. Because
Hmm.
when you're in that circle, when you're upset that other people don't see you the way you want to be seen or respond to you the way you want to be responded, you can externalize that and say, well, they don't get it. Well, they don't understand the complexities of gender. Well, they don't, however you want to phrase that.
Mhm.
So I definitely did have a lot of that, which is what I was putting on my family as well, when it was, they don't accept all of the pain I've had and all of these experiences that I'm encountering, rather than recognizing that I can own that. And I can, I can be causing the matter of my own life, rather than just being affecting the matter of how other people choose to respond to me.
Mhm. Mhm. I appreciate how you're able to get into the worldview of someone who is experiencing these thoughts. And I think that that's so important, to recognize the humanity even in people we really disagree with. And there's it that's really great insight into, just as you described, how somebody can take on these rigid beliefs just because of their particular situation or their vulnerabilities, and there's still so much growth that could be had from that. And how do you try to connect with people who are still experiencing those feelings, who are on that extreme left in the progressive ideology? Do you have a way that you try to connect, or are you just more about speaking your mind and maybe planting a seed, if so?
No, I definitely do. I want as many diverse perspectives as possible, because I don't think I've landed anywhere yet. Like, I'm not convinced that I'm right about anything. I'm trying to look at what works, and my gauge for correctness is, does this work or does this not work? And by
Mm-hmm.
workability, I mean whether I am feeling fulfilled and happy, and whether or not I am calm and at peace.
Mm-hmm.
But I also mean other people's too. If I'm calm and you tell me you're not, then I get that something isn't working in our relationship. And so
Mm-hmm.
I really love that diversity of ideas. But it's interesting, because one thing I have found is that when you get to the farther left area,
Mm-hmm.
people will talk to me, but they won't talk to me publicly. There's
Oh,
a bit of
interesting.
a cancellation culture going on over there. When people don't think the right things, we cut them off. We don't talk to them. We shun
Mm-hmm.
them.
Mm-hmm.
And so some people won't talk to me at all, but a bunch will talk to me. However, they won't publicly share that they talk to me.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than record something or even just kind of have a public discussion, they will talk to me privately and
Mm-hmm.
not want to put that out, which is fine. I absolutely will respect anybody's opinions and thoughts on that. But it's, to me, a little bit telling of what's going on in that area, that it's considered to be wrong and bad to talk to people who have certain views.
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
encountered that early on in my videos. I have a friend, Chanel Fall. She's up in
Oh,
Ottawa.
yeah.
She's been a big voice here. And I was going up to record with her and Catherine Cronus
Mm-hmm.
to do a video we were going to put out. And I had published this, that I was going to be going up to meet them. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of people took great offense to that. And they actually went after my directorship at our local food bank to try to get me kicked off of that, because I was even talking to Chanel.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a kind of funny moment for me at that point, because when they did this, my initial response was to defend myself, was to come in and say, whoa, 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 I didn't even say I agree with her and everything. I will talk to her. But
Mm-hmm.
then I realized, even though I had known her quite well at that point, we'd had many conversations, I didn't even really know what I disagreed with her on. I knew we wouldn't see
Mm-hmm.
everything eye to eye, but when I'm having conversations, I'm not looking for where we disagree. I'm looking for where we can collaborate and work together and understand
Mm-hmm.
each other. And so
Mm-hmm.
I knew lots of things that Chanel and I agreed on, and I had areas where I suspected we may disagree, but I didn't even know for sure, because we hadn't delved into those areas. And it's just a very different approach than I think many people are taking online these days, where it's just looking for the argument, looking for where we disagree so that we can duke it out
Mm-hmm.
and try to make the other person look stupid, or have ill intention or whatever. I don't even know what the goal is, because it seems very counterproductive to me.
Yeah, it reminds me of those like news shows from I guess like the 90s or early 2000s, when they always would bring in the two sides and then let them have an argument. And I just think, what is the point of this conflict? It's conflict for entertainment's sake. It sets people up in a really weird dynamic.
Exactly. And I get asked to do a lot of podcasts and panel discussions now. And for me, that's my vetting point, is if you expect me to come on and debate you or debate someone
Mm-hmm.
else, like, I have no interest in that. I think debate is an interesting sport, I suppose, but it's certainly not for me. If you want to
Mm-hmm.
have a dialogue, if you want to get to know each other more and kind of explore the nuances, then that's wonderful. That's what I want to spend my day doing.
Yeah, that's right up my alley too. I agree with you. Something that you said a little bit ago about children, I wanted to go into that a little bit, because you said you're yourself the parent of a teenager,
Mhm.
and you have been involved in the school board issue quite a bit. And you talked about how schools are edging children towards gender ideology. And that's something that I've been very concerned about, because I think that there's such a difference. There's a world of difference between being tolerant or accepting, or even celebrating people as they are, and that versus pushing people into being something or encouraging them to be something else. And what I see with the school curriculum and with what we're doing in education broadly in the US, and it seems like in Canada as well, is a real encouragement of children to consider adopting a different gender identity. And I think that is that's a recipe for disaster. Personally, I just put a lot of my own opinion out there when I was asking you for yours, but feel free to disagree with me if you do. But I'd love to hear what you think about that.
No, I agree with kind of how you phrased that. I have an interesting journey on this as well. So my daughter's adopted. She came to live with me a few years ago during the beginning part of COVID. So I didn't go through the early portion of raising her, but I had the later portion. And when she came to live with me, she was attending online school, as were many people. And she actually came from a city a few hours away, and she just kept attending that school online because schools were shut down. But the following year, she was going to be going to our big city high school here, where there'd be 2,000 plus kids, which was very exciting to her because she was in a tiny high school in a small community. And I was worried for myself because I knew what it was like in schools 20 years ago when I was in high school. And that was not that was a hostile place for somebody who's trans. And I was worried, what if my daughter encounters pushback because I'm trans, and maybe her friends don't want to come over or hang out with her or something. And that might create challenges for her and problems with our relationship. So that was my fear going in. And I was really quite nervous about this. And then when she went to school, I quickly realized that it was the exact opposite, which was nice at first. For the first 2 weeks, I was like, wow, I'm really cool. Like, kids love that I'm trans, and that's very nice. And I'm so glad that things have changed. And I am glad that things have changed, because when I was in school, there was no mention of anything here. I knew how I felt. I was completely closeted. I told nobody until I was 18, even though I had known this for many, many years prior. And that's not healthy for a kid. That built a lot of shame for me. So I'm glad that we have an environment that has some openness. At the same time, what I sensed pretty quickly was that there was almost a hyperfixation on this too. It was cool to have identity. It doesn't take a lot of looking to see that there's like 50 or 60 different prefixes you can stick on now to describe your sexuality or your gender. And to me, that really suggests that this is an identity thing. It's a finding your place. It's a finding a unique way to express yourself, which is okay. I think every generation has had those things. For me, it was being goth. I mean, I wasn't goth, but for my generation, it was being goth or having tattoos or listening to punk music or some of those things. And maybe that's this generation's thing, but that concerns me because this has longstanding implications when you move into hormonal and surgical interventions. It's one thing when you are looking at maybe getting a piercing or maybe getting a tattoo you're going to regret. And I won't let my daughter get either. She had a few piercings, but I won't let her get any of the more, novel ones, because I don't want her to regret those. I'm like, you can wait till you're a bit older before you do that. But when it comes to something like transitioning, there's those implications and risks. And I think where I draw a line too, that's certainly harder than some people's line, is even social transition concerns me. So social transition is the names and pronouns. So this is the nothing hormonal or surgical yet. This is just, we're going to call you a new name and we're going to use new pronouns because you've asked us to. And I'm not convinced that that's a good thing in all cases, because we're treating that like it's a neutral act, like whatever, right? Just like kids might say, I'm going to be a pilot today when I'm playing house. And we say, okay, you're an airline pilot. And the next day you're not, and they're playing make-believe. We treat it like it's like that. And in my experience, it certainly isn't like that. I really didn't mind being called he, him. I started to transition at 28 and I had always been gender dysphoric, but I mean, I'm biologically male. I was a man. I had a beard. I knew all of these things. And so when you'd see me and call me he, that made a lot of sense. I didn't like that I was a man, but it was a natural response to call me that, until I had that small affirming circle who started to call me Julia and would call me she, her. And all of a sudden then when I would be at work and you'd call me he and call me Jason, I would, no, I really didn't like that, because you just offended me in a sense, even though you didn't even know that I was transitioning. I was hiding this. And so I look at the social transition and say, this is not a neutral act. We have lots of kids who are gender nonconforming, who are experimenting. We have lots of barriers we've created in terms of how we say that boys and girls should behave, and crossing those lines and experimenting is great. I know Lisa Sullivan Davis in her book Tomboy talks about how enriching it is for young girls to be able to experience things that are not stereotypically feminine, and they tend to be more successful when they've had that diversity of experience. So we should encourage that. But if instead we say, yes, you want to wear a dress and play with dolls, little boy, we're gonna change your name and we're gonna change your pronouns, we're almost shoehorning them into that place of transition, which maybe that will be right for the kid. That was me as a kid, and that I did not grow out of that. But I know a lot of the research does show that most people grow out of it. Mm-hmm. However, if you do that social transition and you kind of affirm the name and pronouns early on, then they're less likely to, because now they have to kind of come out to everybody again and detransition in a sense and say, actually, I'm not that person anymore. I'm not this anymore. And so I have a lot of concerns around that.
Yeah, it's interesting when you say that it's being treated like it's a neutral act, and it's very much not. It's a significant act. It's a therapeutic intervention in and of itself to socially transition somebody. And at the same time, it's being treated like, oh, it's so, just a kid can just opt into this, and then the school's going to support them on this with no kind of vetting or diagnostic process for figuring out who this is going to benefit and who it's not. So it's this really easy thing for a kid to do, and then the school will support them wholeheartedly in a lot of cases. And the parent is being, this is interesting how parents are being framed as inherently dangerous to their children in these discussions with schools, where letting a parent know or getting a parent involved in that process is somehow there's been some really strong language. What did Justin Trudeau just recently say about this? He had some really strong words around silencing or isolating these vulnerable people just by letting parents in on that conversation. So it's either a neutral act that means nothing, or it's this very critical thing that if parents find out, we've got to really worry about these children for their safety. So there's so much inherent contradiction in that conversation and how that's being had.
Yes, no, I delegate to a lot of school boards, and I've made a lot of videos on this topic because mm-hmm. the dissonance between those two positions I cannot reconcile. So mm-hmm. I think what you're referring to is that in Ontario and in many school boards in Canada, I don't know where it is in the States in terms of the different states, but up here, it's very common that if a student does not want their parents to know about a transition at school, the parents mm-hmm. are not informed. Mm-hmm. And this is actively done by the school. This is not a teacher sees some cross-gender play on the playground and reports it to the parents. We're saying if a kid comes and says, I would like to be called Julia and I would like to be called she, her in all of my classes in every way in this school, then the teacher will say, okay. And mm-hmm. they will go through a process with the administration to make sure this is on record, that all the teachers know, that substitute teachers will know. And if the kid also says, and I don't want my parents to know about this because I don't think that they're going to like it, or they're going to let me do it, or they will be unhappy, then they will also actively not tell the parents, and they'll have a procedure in place to make sure the parents don't know, that says, we call this little kid Julia, but if we have to call home, we call them Jason. Mm-hmm. And mm-hmm. this is very common. And to me, that's just mind blowing, because we're making the assumption that the parent is harmful and is dangerous. And mm-hmm. of course, there are harmful households. This is not new to schools, but that's the point. It's not new. There has always been a risk of harm in households. And this is why mm-hmm. we have children's aid services that specializes in identifying those households and supporting those households. Mm-hmm. And in any other case in school, if we suspect that a kid is at harm at home, then we contact children's aid, because they're the ones who can determine if that's a bona fide risk, and they can support the family. But in this one area, we've said, no, we can't even go there. We're just not going to even tell the parents, because there might be a risk of harm here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting. And it's interesting how we got to this point where we're thinking about families this way. Because like you said, there've always been families that will, fall outside of the norm and will be harmful, as you say. And then there's a process for that. And there's been a long-standing process. But this attitude now around this issue seems to be that the average parent is a danger to their own child. And that seems like a really concerning turning point in language.
Exactly. And then for me, that comes to the dissonance between these two positions of mm-hmm. the argument to let kids do it without medical support, without even their parents knowing, is this is a neutral act. This is almost nothing. It's just a name. Who cares?
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, we're saying, but it has to happen. We have to do it because the kid desperately needs this. We cannot tell the parent because the parent might get in the way and the kid desperately needs this. And I'm like, how can you have it both ways? How can it be so important and so impactful to do, but yet also so not risky to do, that like that is a no-brainer? That certainly isn't my experience having transitioned, certainly isn't the experience I've seen with many of the transgender students who I have known and who I have worked with. And I know people who are pushing these things, they mean well. They look at kids like me in school and they look at the mental health consequences that I experienced by not dealing with this, not having a place where I could even discuss it. And they say, we don't want to create that. But I think we've swung it very far in the other direction in response to that. And I don't think that helps anybody at all.
No, and it's really strange, and it feels like it's the kids that end up, the families and the kids who end up really losing out in this, because not only do you have the school not performing a meaningful exploration of what's going on, but the parents are now prevented from doing that. Even if they do know about it, if they want to push back or provide exploratory therapy for their child, or look at this in some other way than just patently affirming, the school won't back them up. So the child has the whole apparatus of the institution behind them. And so the space for honest and genuine exploration of what's going on and what does this mean to that individual child it's just missing in a lot of these pictures.
Yeah. And I know that up here in Canada, a lot of that is because of our anti-conversion therapy laws. So we have laws that, prevents conversion therapy for gay and trans individuals. And I think they followed the gay pattern on that because, of course, there is a history of trying to, convert the gay
Pray
away.
The gay away, yeah.
Pray the gay away, exactly.
Yeah.
And in that case, I understand why we don't want to do that, because if somebody's not sure if they're gay, they might be gay. Experimenting is probably a good idea. Why don't you try being in a gay relationship and see what happens? Maybe you're going to be like, wow, this is me, this fits. Maybe you're going to be like, no, this isn't me. And that's probably a very risk-free way to determine if that fits. But I don't think the same thing applies when it comes to surgical and hormonal intervention. I think that trying it out and going, oh, I actually want to back out. If I were to do that now, I have had genital surgery. Right. I have had things that are going to have implications. And so I think it's good to have that part up front, not to convert, not to try to stop me, but to say, is this the right solution? Are there comorbidities? Are there other things going on that might be better solutions for you? Knowing and kind of telling the individual from the beginning, like, if not, like, absolutely, you can transition, but we're going to do our due diligence the same way we do with anything else in the medical community, right? We don't jump to the more extreme intervention. We say, maybe this medication that has no impact will help you. Maybe sleep will help you. Maybe a better diet will help you. No, we need to do gastric bypass surgery. Okay, well, we'll go to that, but like, we're not going to just start there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really wise. It's a measured approach, leaving the more extreme interventions off until, you've explored other things first. One thing that you talked about in one of your videos that I thought was interesting, you touched on the drag queen story hour phenomenon. And I don't mean to like get into like the upper echelons of why, but like, where is this all coming from societally? Is this just compassion? Are people just trying to is this what do you think? Is it well-meaning, well-intentioned people who are just, making some really extreme choices? What do you think this is that we're seeing with this celebration of these extremes?
That video was a lot of fun. I was nervous when I put that one out. It was fairly early on in what I was doing, and it kind of moved into a new step of controversial topics that I wasn't quite sure what I was going to encounter. But I did it because I am at a loss for why people are defending drag queen story hour. Like, as somebody who is trans, I find it offensive. I present this way because I have deep gender dysphoria. I'm trying to present normally. My ideal goal, like most, trans people, would be to blend in, would be to not be noticed, to not stick out, so I can live my life and just care for my kids and go to normal social things and just not stick out. And then we have drag queens who's, adopting the most regressive forms of stereotypical femininity, often in a sexual manner for show. And as the drag queen phenomenon for adults has proliferated and kind of taken off over the last 10 years with things like RuPaul's Drag Race, for me, that has been deleterious because people more and more equate me with that. It's like, oh, I understand what you're going for, what you're doing, because I watched RuPaul's Drag Race, and it's
Oh
like,
gosh,
that's very offensive to me.
it's
That
like
would be
a
like me saying,
caricature.
yeah, it's like, I understand what it's like to be Arab because I've watched Aladdin. And it's like, well, that's
Oh
not
wow.
your best model of what it means to live in an Arab country, right? Like
Yeah.
that's a cartoon movie that was made by a bunch of white people. And
Yeah.
it's, I, to me, that's what this seems like to begin with. So I'm not a fan of drag. That doesn't mean I'm out to stop drag. That's an adult activity that people can do what they want. But I do find it troublesome. But then you look at extending that to little children, and I'm just like, I don't even understand the why. And so I researched it before I made that video, and what I was finding was people saying this shows them acceptance and diversity and makes it fun and all of this. And my takeaway was always, I do see the importance of that. I do see why it's valuable to be able to show, not really young children, but children of elementary school age that, trans people do exist, because you might encounter them in society, just like we show them that blind people exist or people of different races exist. But if that's really our goal, why wouldn't we show them someone like me who is presenting as normally as possible and just say, yeah, Julia is biologically male, but that wasn't working. And so she decides to wear dresses, and that's okay, right? We can all accept that and then move on, rather than go to drag queen and kind of take this really extreme, fake, clown-like interpretation of it. Like, I do not understand what that's meant to achieve. And I'm at a loss for why people dive in and defend it so deeply. That's an answer I haven't really been able to get, to be honest.
Yeah, it's really so interesting. And I guess because I do have young kids, but we don't do library story hours. I haven't seen that I haven't been up close to that, but I keep seeing the videos come up, and I think, wow, it's so perplexing to me that this has become this mainstream thing for children to be involved in. I mean, I always thought drag was kind of fun and just campy and kind of adult humor. And I didn't have any kind of it wasn't a political thing to me. It just seemed like kind of a fun thing some people do. There's the drag brunches, which I never actually went to one, but I always thought they looked like kind of a fun time. And I didn't have any kind of a judgment about that. It just seemed like one of many things people might entertain themselves with. But the idea of mixing children into that, it seems, kind of carnival-esque. And why is that
Precisely.
mainstream? I don't get it.
Well, exactly. And
Yeah.
one thing I found really encouraging, so I have many friends now who are gender critical, many connections in the anti-woke community and locally. Many of those individuals were the ones who ran in the school board election that I mentioned back in 2022. And as I have come to know those individuals, I've met all their kids. We'll hang out, we'll get together and have parties. And these individuals, I think a lot of people would assume, they're trying to shield their kids from anybody who's trans and completely let their kids not know, but they're fine with it. I exist and they want them to know that I exist. They just don't want it to move into the place of encouragement. They want to be able to say, yeah, Julia is what Julia is. And to me, that's been a healthy balance. The same thing I've encountered with my sister's kids who are quite young. And, the kids know enough to be like, okay, I don't really understand it because you're a kid and you don't understand sex yet. But like, okay, yeah, Julia used to be Jason and now we call her Julia, and that's fine. The kids don't care. We don't have to go deeper, but instead we're saying kids need to know, and we're going to use some of these books and Drag Queen Story Hour to dive into things that are above them, that just isn't necessary. And I think part of it is they're trying to support these kids who are dysphoric and say, that way they'll know there's options and things. But like, I knew how I felt my whole life. I found the word transgender when I was 12, and that was back in a time when it was nowhere in the school. It was nowhere in the healthcare system. This was me Googling, like, how do I turn myself into a girl? Because I was desperate. But I knew I felt this way when I was younger. If there was like a single poster in my school saying, like, you struggle with this, go talk to your guidance counselor, I would have known that was me. We don't need to shove it down everyone's throats. We don't need to have it everywhere. It's like, just, and the other thing too is therapists and counselors weren't looking for it back then. I saw 4 counselors before grade 6. Like, people knew that I was struggling, that things weren't working, but no one was looking at gender identity. Now we're at the point that if a kid is struggling and they're getting, therapeutic support, people are going to zero in and go, maybe there's something
it's
here.
Being suggested. Yeah, absolutely.
We don't need to show them drag queens so that kids will self-identify. We have a much better system to support kids like little Jason at this point.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. It's like we're laying out the red carpet and we're making everything about this in order to support people who could feel supported with less of a pomp and circumstance and less of a big net that drags other people into it as well.
And that for me is a risk, both selfishly and selflessly. I'm scared because I don't want people to make mistakes that I regret. I don't want people to transition and regret those transitions. I know people who have detransitioned and deeply regret, the path they've taken and some of the changes they made to their bodies. So I don't want that to happen to children and adults. But there's also for me a selfish element too, because as that has happened, as we've seen so many young people move into this, following their friends, kind of moving into an identity place, I worry that they're going to regret that when they're 28 and they want to have kids and they can't because they've had a hysterectomy. And many people who detransition become very hostile towards trans people because they feel that they weren't given the right information. They were duped into something that didn't work. And they're very understandably angry. And I think, is that the kind of thing that's going to unwind the progress we've made of acceptance of people like me? Because we're going to get so many detransitioners potentially in 5 or 10 years that it will be very easy for the average person to think this is all a sham, this is all bad, this all needs to go away, rather than, no, there's a small group of people who are deeply dysphoric. There always have been. We do well to support them. And there's a lot of other people who got caught in this identity politics that we're playing that should not have transitioned. And that's one of the reasons I spoke up too, is to say, how do we separate this? How do we remember that there's more than one group of people here? There's more than one thing happening. And it's not a one size fits all solution. We don't need to abolish transition, but we also don't need to give it and shouldn't give it to everybody who goes through a period of thinking they want it.
Yeah, I think, and that's like when you were saying that you have friends who in the gender critical spaces who still you find that they're accepting of you and that they, you're part of their family circle, and really the false teaming and this polarization of you're either on this side or you're on this side can both lead, I would think, to a perception of intolerance where it is not, and also to the cultivation of intolerance where it wouldn't have been. And so, that's something that I find really concerning, is that these ideologies, the gender ideology, the race ideology, it makes people feel like we have two teams, like there's us and them, and people pick sides and become dug in, and there's sort of a cultural backlash. And so you could end up with people making judgments that where they really wouldn't have previously. They would have had more of a curiosity or neutrality. Now things have become political. Something like for instance, just going back to drag, that I still find that sort of like campy and funny, and it's easy to laugh about. How did we get here? But something like a drag performer, which is this caricature, cartoon, clownish thing, I would have had a non-political thought about. I wouldn't have thought one way or the other. Now I see that and I feel like I don't know, like defensive. Like I want to know you're a groomer. I mean, I've got these associations. Why would I think that it's because the culture has pushed it that way? And it's the same with so many things. It's like pitting people against each other based on race, pitting people against each other based on sex, and now with gender, and just, it's not two camps. Like you said, it's not just two camps.
And that has been a large reason why I'm doing what I'm doing as well, is that we do have this divide that seems to be getting ever wider and ever more hostile. And so there's lots of people who are on the more right-leaning side of it who don't know a transgender person. They've never met a transgender person. They've certainly never had a conversation, or definitely not a friendship. And we know from looking at how gay rights progressed that what changed people's hearts was knowing somebody. It's easy to say, all relationships should be between a man and a woman because this is how my relationship works, and that that works for me, and this is unnecessary, until you know someone and you see their pain and you understand that they're not groomers, as they were called back in the 70s, that they are individuals who are just trying to live their life. And that was what changed people's minds. And I think that trans individuals on the progressive left are doing a really bad job because they're angry and they're yelling and they're taking kind of that critical social justice approach that does not change hearts. So my approach has been get as deep as I can into the right-leaning circles, because then you can know a transgender person who's friendly, who's conversational, just so you can see my life and come to know me. Not that I'm looking to change anybody's mind. I'm not looking to do that. Insofar, I should qualify that. I am looking to change people's minds in terms of keeping people from the extremism, of reminding them that transgender people can be normal, that transgender people are just trying to live their life. I'm not trying to convince them of any particular ideology or even any particular political agenda. Like, I'm not looking to argue washrooms or something like that with an individual, but I am looking to just show them that not everybody who's trans is looking to groom their children.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I think that's really great, showing the humanity behind, what gets lumped into identity categories. We're at the end of the day, we're all people. We're all
Mhm.
individuals. And so wrapping up, I really appreciate this conversation and the chance to get to know you a little bit better and hear your thoughts on these things. And is there anything that you think we left out that we should have talked about, or do you want to
Mm.
offer next steps or what's next for you?
Oh, I could talk to you all day about this. We didn't talk about pronouns. I don't know if you
No,
want to. We
oh,
don't
that's
have
true.
to, but if you
Yeah.
want to go into that, we can always open that can of worms.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, if you have some thoughts about that, I'd love to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. So my journey around pronouns was interesting.
Mhm.
I went down the same path I think many trans people do at the beginning, where you have this dysphoria. You feel like something in you, along with societal expectations of what's expected of you and your gender, doesn't work. And so it feels really good. You get the warm fuzzies when you're getting these different pronouns.
Mhm.
And so I experienced that in my small affirming group, which that group is becoming larger over time. And these were good people. These were people who loved me and cared about me and wanted to affirm me.
Mhm.
But I, of course, would get he, him sometimes, because people make mistakes, because I'm fairly tall and I have a fairly low voice, because they knew me as Jason, and I'm asking them to make this change in how they're seeing me. And so that would happen. And I realized it would devastate me. Like, when I would get he, him,
Mhm.
it would put me into a place of wanting to just be by myself for like 3 days at home and not wanting to talk to anybody, especially that person, because I felt uncomfortable. And I wasn't angry at them, because I knew that they meant well, but
Mhm.
I was upset because it pushed me back into reality, because I was living
Mhm.
outside of reality,
Mhm.
imagining that I was biologically female as much as you are. And the
Mhm.
minute that someone calls me he and calls you she, it would
Mhm.
remind me, oh, right, people notice that I'm not biologically female. They might love me and care for me anyways, but they know I'm not biologically female, and I don't register for them as the same as
Mhm.
someone who's biologically female. And because I was not living in that reality, that was really devastating, right? I had this construct that was being ripped down by someone else's language.
Mhm.
And it was when I came to realize that I'd say I went on kind of the greatest transformation towards the mindset that I have now. This was
Mhm.
during my coaching time. And
Mhm.
I realized that living outside of reality is not helpful. I am biologically male, and there are implications of that. It would be as though I thought that I was the best singer in the world, and I'm not.
Mhm.
I knew some theater kids back when I was in high school who thought they were the best singer in the world, and they weren't. And they're constantly being pulled apart because other people don't treat them like they're a diva. Other people don't
Mhm.
worship their voice the way that they think they should get. And I
Mhm.
realized I was doing the same thing. And if I accept my biological reality, then I don't have to be hurt by that, because you're just acknowledging what I am, which is in many ways kind of beautiful, right? That you see who I am, who I actually am. And as I said, these are people who love me, who care for me,
Mhm.
who want community with me, but they do know that I'm biologically male. And
Mhm.
that was the biggest hump that I kind of went through. And it brought me to that place of not having to care about pronouns or really any of the language at all. I
Mhm.
use she, her for me. My family uses she, her for me. And most people do, because they know that that's what I'm going for.
Mhm.
But if somebody doesn't, whether it's because of an accident or whether it's because they have a principle where they say, I refuse to use the pronouns that, somebody wants to use, it doesn't, I realize it has nothing to do with me, really.
Mhm.
We've
Mhm.
created this narrative as though everybody has this obligation. And I don't think that's fair or helpful. That moves into compelled speech, which is dangerous in so many ways in my mind. So I do think it's a little bit insensitive to intentionally use words that people don't want used towards them. I certainly don't
Right.
want to do that to other people, but being insensitive and being a bit of an asshole shouldn't be illegal. It's just
Mhm.
maybe not very kind.
Yeah. Yeah. That's well said. And you're describing the process of sort of learning not to put your own self-worth and need for validation in the hands of other people, and instead taking on responsibility for yourself and reality, and and not allowing other people to impact your own sense of value in your own life with their words.
Yeah, I'd say I went through 3 phases there. The first phase was that external validation of other people need to say the right things to me and support me in such a way that I feel validated as
Mhm.
female.
Mhm.
Then I went through this phase of it doesn't matter what other people say, because I know I'm female. I can validate
Mhm.
myself,
Mhm.
which I think is what we teach people a lot, is the whole find it in yourself. I didn't stay there though. I kind of went to this next phase of, oh wait, I'm not, and it doesn't matter. Like that sort of decentering identity to the point of I don't really care what I am. I don't really, language is useful to communicate and that's about it. I don't have to label myself at all. So I'm really quite apathetic at this point to the words, like what am I? I don't know. It depends on how you want to define all these words. And you tell me your definition and then we'll know what I am as a result. And then we can go have coffee. And that's all that matters. It doesn't matter, kind of working out I don't know where I was going with that. This is what happens when I talk for this long.
Yeah, I know. I get like that too. No, I think that, what you said about not wanting to use language that's going to be, you don't want to hurt someone's feelings. If you care about somebody and they're sincere, you're going to, generally try to be supportive of them in the best way that you can. And I feel like I don't know a lot of trans people in my real life. I haven't known a lot of trans people. I haven't known anybody that I have misgendered or used pronouns that they wouldn't want for themselves against, because I feel like that would be rude. But when it comes to young people who are playing with gender identity and wearing the buttons, and they've got the they them one day and the he him the next day, and then this, it's just she they sometimes. My stance is to usually avoid using pronouns with that person and just use their name, or try not to be inflammatory. I don't want to directly be inflammatory with the kid, but I don't want to, I see that as kind of a manipulation that it's complex, and it depends on the person and it depends on the situation, but it can, and I guess it's very difficult to speak in general terms about something that's more individual. So on pronoun usage for other people, I think that that's a nuanced thing that and my whole like video on pronouns was really about how to handle being asked to give your own if you don't want to. Because I do think that when you're making a decision about how to talk about another person, you have to use a lot of factors to decide that. And one of the important ones is going to be your connection and your perception of the other person and your perception of their sincerity and how you want to, interact with them. If someone is really presenting as female, to say he, if you think that person is sincere, that seems like a hurtful thing. It seems like a needless thing. Why would you make that point? But sometimes you might question the person's sincerity, or you might there just might be a host of other reasons. And so I think it's just, again, it's an individual decision that we should all be able to make. And like you said, sometimes people can be jerks, and that shouldn't be illegal either. It's very individual. I am very against the idea that we all need to play with pronouns in order to get rid of the concept that we can even know. It's a linguistic tool. This is how we talk about people in the third person, gendered pronouns. It's just how we've done. It's what English does. And to demand that everybody supply pronouns at all times when supplying their name just upholds an illusion that we can't know, that we shouldn't be able to perceive gender when looking at people. And that, I think, is being done out of an overabundance of compassion for people who are presenting ambiguously or androgynously, or when you're unsure, when in fact there are polite ways to handle the fact that some people do present in a way that causes confusion. We can create a space where there's room for those people to clarify without creating an illusion that nobody ever knows. I probably used like way too many words to express something that could have been more simply expressed. But
no, I love what you touched on there, because it's like I have gone to great lengths to try to present as feminine as possible. People should know what I'm going for. It's pretty obvious. Like I have been on estrogen, which has led to breast development. I wear a lot of feminine clothing. I have long hair. Like there's a lot of things there that suggest what I'm going for. People may choose to use it. They may choose not to use it. And they may slip up. That's going to happen, but it should be pretty obvious. But what it is what I think you described of this ambiguous thing that's come in, the non-binary side of, I reject the idea of a gender dichotomy at all. Which I guess is a political statement one can take, but that's not dysphoria. When people tell me that they're dysphoric, as non-binary, I don't know what that means, because how can you be dysphoric that you are, I don't even have the words to describe what that's supposed to be. To me, that's always been a political statement of, I think that our gender stereotypes are problematic and we shouldn't have those, and fine. I guess you can hold that, but it's been conflated with gender dysphoric individuals like myself to deleterious effect, because now I get asked pronouns all the time. And it's like, you do realize that's frustrating for me, right? To be asked pronouns. Like I had this one meeting a few years ago at work, kind of earlier on, and same thing. I'm wearing a dress. You could see my breasts. I have makeup on, everything. And at the end of the meeting, our consultant said, "Oh, Julia, I forgot to ask you your pronouns in front of everybody."
Gosh.
And nobody else has asked. And I'm kind of like, why would we need to? Like, I call myself Julia in this meeting. I am dressed like this. What do you think I'm going for?
I hadn't
We're not
even
asking
thought of
Jeff.
that. That hadn't even occurred to me that it could be offensive on that end, and hurtful on that end as well. Gosh.
The consultant didn't give us his pronouns, but he was very clearly a man. He was biologically male. We had no reason to think he wasn't, and so we didn't need to ask him what his pronouns were. And I think people hear that, and on the one side of the spectrum, they say, "See, this is why we have to ask everybody their pronouns all the time." So we're being, and I'm like, no. Or we could say, sex exists. Sex exists. Biology exists. The two sexes exists, and I am biologically male. I'm presenting feminine. We all know that. We can choose to support me. We can choose not to support me, but we don't need this whole world of infinite possibility, because that is very ideological at that point.
Yeah, and I think that there's a way to handle that that's polite, that says, maybe in an intro or in a meeting, that says, as we go around, everybody state your name, and if you'd like to offer pronouns, you're welcome to do so. And then that's it. Just go around the meeting, allow people, if they feel like they need to offer that up to make a clarification, they can offer that. And that's code. It's still coded language. It's still code for, you may not perceive me the way that I want you to. So I'm just going to go ahead and clarify so that you'll know what I'm going for here. And then you can move along. And I think that there's space for that to be sort of an etiquette, what do you want to call it? Like a little ritual of etiquette, but without doing away with the concept of sex and how somebody's presenting altogether as anything related to how we address them.
And I think you're so right on that. I know of some individuals I've encountered in my various experiences who have various disabilities, like physical disabilities or mental disabilities, and they will choose to share because we can support them by knowing the certain thing about them that may not be obvious. And so they will come out and say, just so you know, I have a hearing impairment, so I struggle to hear. If you can not cover your mouth and, kind of talk very clearly, that's helpful to me. And I think that's great that we create space to do that. But same thing, we don't all have to clarify we don't have a hearing impairment in every introduction. It's they will put that out there, and we will have grace to be able to receive that and accommodate. And if you have a special request around pronouns, put it out there. And I think that's great. But expecting it and acting like that should be the default is weird and also, I think, unhelpful.
Yeah, I agree. That's well said. That's a good analogy. So Julia, where would you like people to follow you? I'm going to put links down in the notes, but do you want to give out verbally your socials or anywhere people can look for more content?
Yeah, absolutely. So I call myself Alotta online. Because it rhymes, and I think it's funny.
Cute.
It's cute, yeah. And believe it or not, there aren't many Alotta Malottas out there. So I'm Alotta Malotta on everything. I'm Alotta Malotta on YouTube. I'm Alotta Malotta on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok. I spend a lot of my time on Twitter, or at least I have in the past, because that's where a lot of these conversations are taking place. I don't know if that's going to be my main platform going forward. I'm currently on a Twitter hiatus as I spend time reading and writing and doing chats like this, but kind of not being as active in the discourse. I'm growing a YouTube channel where I think I'll be putting a lot of my my Alotta Thoughts videos going forward, because it's an easier way to share them for people who aren't on Twitter. And I've been getting deeper on Instagram as well. So I'm kind of, those are probably the three places to look for me: Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And I'm Alotta Malotta on all of them. Awesome.
I will put those links down below. And thank you for a really great conversation. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Yeah, this has been fun. I would love to come back.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you.